Hello everybody, welcome back to CHRTC 309. This is Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so in the next little bit here, we are going to be looking at the two kind of generations that we mean when we talk about youth. First, the Millennials, who we have a ton of data on. And you might be thinking like, oh, Millennials are kind of old. And it's true, right? Roughly the oldest of the Millennials today would be about 42. So into the kind of the beginning of middle age. The youngest of them would be 27. So really kind of very much at the outside range of what I would define as youth, right? Or I would say like emerging adults, roughly people who are under the age of 29, so 18 to 29. I put in emerging adults. And our millennials are almost completely out of that range. Why talk about them then in a class on the sociology of youth and religion? Because we have a just absolutely huge ton of data on millennials, right? We collected so much data on them when they were young that we now have just an absolute treasure trove of data. So, very good. Gen Z, obviously not in this lecture, but in a subsequent lecture, I'll talk about Gen Z as well. And obviously this is the incoming cohort of young people and the ones that will be driving religious change going forward for a very long time. So let's dig in and talk about our friends, the millennials. Okay, so when we talk about the millennials, we are talking about the generation born roughly between 1981 and 1994. Some people will put the ranges either a little wider or a little bit narrower than this, but this is kind of my preferred one, right? I might include 1980, right? Just throw 1980 in for millennials. But I wouldn't want to go very far beyond 1995 or earlier than 1980 for the millennials. And kind of generally speaking, right, the millennials are the generation that would have been kind of around 18 years old, 17, 18, 19. The first of the millennials would have been that age when we hit the year 2000. Okay. So the first couple slides here, I'm taking a lot of this information from a scholar named Jean Twenge. So Jean Twenge, you're going to hear more about her because I draw on Jean quite a bit in this context and in some different contexts. And Jean Twenge is basically what's referred to as a generational scholar. She's a psychologist, but she's done most of her work sort of specializing in generational differences. And she initially did her work on her generation, which is Gen X, followed it up with two books on millennials, which is where we're getting a lot of the Twenge kind of little snippets that we have on these first two slides of this course. So, what does... okay, and those two books are Generation Me and The Narcissism Epidemic. So not exactly maybe the most salutary of millennials, sadly. Okay, so what does she say about the millennials, right? That they have these kinds of characteristics. That they don't need anyone's approval, right? A firm belief in self-expression and the idea that the only person you need to impress is yourself is something that was sort of ingrained in millennials, largely by kind of both pop culture, right? Things like Sesame Street and the television programs that they consumed, and by the parenting philosophies that their parents, principally the baby boomers, though a little bit of kind of the older part of Gen X, were taught as they were entering their child-rearing years, right? Everything was about self-esteem, self-esteem, self-esteem. The only person you were needing to actually please was yourself. And this really is deeply ingrained in the millennials. Assert yourself, love yourself, right? Focus on the self. Millennials are very focused on self-gratification and self-esteem. And Twenge says, this is her opinion, not mine, though it perhaps is hard to argue, that the sort of self-esteem based parenting that was pushed with baby boomers and that then, sort of embedded itself in millennials gave rise to a generation of narcissists, right? People believe that they're special because we were told, I'm a millennial, barely, but I am a millennial. They were told that we're special, right? We were the most special, perfect snowflake in the whole special world, and there's no one like you at all in the whole entire world, leading to, in Twenge's estimation, entitlement and a sense of superiority, especially a superiority compared to the people that came before, right? Millennials have an almost dripping disdain for the 2 or 3 generations prior to them, the Silents, the Boomers, and Generation X. Okay, the rise of the self-empowered self. I mean, millennials, and I think this is pretty consistent. We'll see, I think, something similar with the data I'll take from Christian Smith and his very detailed project on millennials from their teenage years through into emerging adulthood. But millennials, right, had this firm belief that their dreams could become reality, right? That all of them could have fame, fun, fortune, and fulfillment. And in a sense, that this was their right, but also, I mean, this speaks to their optimism, right? The millennials, in a lot of ways, are a very optimistic generation, in the sense that they believe that, good things are going to come because they're so special. So very special. All right, the rise in anxiety. Stress, anxiety, depression were all on the rise for millennials. When they were young, suicide was as well. And the self-focused generation, and I think especially, and this is me speaking a little bit from my position as an observer, having looked at a lot of the data on young people, this is a self-focused generation in lots of ways. And what this has led to is a sort of continuing of a long-standing trend, but a real acceleration of it, of deinstitutionalization, where millennials have really moved away from a sort of institutional context and set themselves up almost as islands. Everybody in the millennial generation is singing, the old Simon and Garfunkel song, "I am a rock, I am an island," right? Very self-focused and self-confident, but also, a rock feels no pain and an island never cries. A lot of loneliness from this, right? Rising rates of loneliness that start with the millennials are going to get a lot worse with Gen Z. But yeah, there's definitely loneliness and pressure to stand alone. All right, what else do we see in millennials? Right, a rise in apathy, right? Declining belief in the efficacy of work and sacrifices, right? Because they saw principally their baby boomer parents work hard and sacrifice. But even for them, and then their older millennial peers and some of the younger Gen Xers, they've seen that it doesn't work out as well, right? There isn't as much space for people to get ahead in life. So combine that with a fading confidence in the power of collective action, right? Less belief that protests and collective action and institutional change is even possible. You get a kind of general pullback from the public sphere in lots of ways, right? They engage in the public sphere when they have to, but not more than that. The sexualized self, according to Twenge, right? Millennials became sexually active earlier than boomers, exploring sexuality as a right and a freedom. Sexual behavior, for the millennials, though, became increasingly detached from emotional involvement. We saw the rise of hookup culture with millennials come in a major way, where sex and emotional attachment are not necessarily contiguous and really were not expected, right? And, this is the first generation not to have pornography, but to have essentially unfettered access to adult content on the internet. And if you want to know how that affects, young people, we will talk a little bit about it in this course, but I teach a course on sociology of youth where we spend a good amount of time talking about this particular question. And then diversity, right? Up to that point, millennials were the most diverse generational cohort of any generational cohort, racially, religiously, ethnically, all those things. Now, Gen Z is more diverse, a little bit later on, but nonetheless, they were quite diverse. The millennials, or we are quite diverse. Um, and yeah, I mean, one of the things that happened sort of towards the beginning of their adult lives, prejudice, persecution, and traditional morality were more or less abandoned. And certainly, they had much more acceptance of, kind of different kind of identities around gender, race, and sexual orientation. But for millennials, this is no great moral achievement because that's just the way it should be. So no big deal. Okay, so we're going to hear a lot about this study in this course. This is the National Study of Youth and Religion. And for our purposes here, it's going to tell us a little bit about millennials and what they were like in around 2010. But just to give you a little bit of background on millennials, who are on the National Study of Youth and Religion, rather, what was it? So basically, it's this panel-based longitudinal study, right? So it followed the same people over about a decade, from about 2003 till about 2015, through 3 different waves of surveys and interviews. Started out with 2,700 interviews of teens and their parents to see how well their religious beliefs aligned, and then tracked those teenagers as they moved, through their teen years into college, and then into emerging adulthood, right? By the time you get to the end, it's winnowed down to about 2,100, and they did about 291 in-person interviews in the first sample. So when you read some of the books that come out of this, it's really interesting because you get to see the same people in these kind of ideographic accounts a few times over the life of the study, which is pretty cool. And yeah, I mean, basically it was meant to follow them and see how their religious and spiritual lives changed. The lead scholar on it is Christian Smith out of University of Notre Dame. So one of the things that's true about the millennials during this phase of their life, right? So at about 2010, as they're sort of, 7 years after the first set of interviews were done. So what was it as they're kind of moving from, say, their teen years and going into college? This is what their life kind of looked like, right? So young people, generally true, multiple layered and big and sometimes unanticipated life transitions. Okay, so what were their lives like, right? They're moving out. They're going to college. They're trying to establish themselves on their own, moving back in, moving back out again, right? Their lives are a little bit of a yo-yo. They go to college and they go to university, right? They're trying to make their way, get that training for what they need to be in the world. They take breaks, right? College doesn't work out. The program they try doesn't work. So they take breaks. They graduate, they drop out, right? These are the normal kind of life transitions that young people go through as they're kind of in their late teens, early 20s. Interestingly, right, they switch career paths. They decide they want to go into one career path. Finding out what it's like to be an engineer or a teacher or whatever doesn't seem appealing to them, so they switch. Maybe they go into their first jobs and they really don't like the career path they've chosen, so they switch again. In this period too, especially as young people kind of transitioned into adulthood, parental separations and remarriages kind of start to pick up and sort of peak in this period, right? As parents think that the impact of divorce and remarriage is lessened on their kids because their kids are now adult, they do tend to happen a little bit more frequently. And obviously, right, young people also in this period, right, when they're young adults are or emerging adults are transitioning, taking jobs, quitting jobs, they're in and out of work, right, trying to find their place in the world. The transition from high school to college and then out of college is one that's marked by switches in friend groups, right? It's actually a period of quite a bit of instability for friend groups, and most friendships kind of don't last through this period, right? Most people move away and kind of separate from their high school friends, and then they make friends in college, and then, they themselves scatter after college, and so those friendships are put to the test. And from a romantic perspective, from a friendship perspective, they are going through multiple transitions kind of all the time. Okay, so what are the challenges facing millennials? Well, one is a kind of failure to launch kind of problem. Entering emerging adulthood, there's a sort of cultural script that says, hey, emerging adults want to be independent, right? They want to separate from their parents. They want to be independent. They want to grow up and do all of the adult things. So basically, there's a kind of natural life script, especially for kind of traditional American white culture that says you move away from home, you become independent, right? You transition from dependence to independence. Now, this has been complicated for millennials in lots of ways, right? You see the last point on there. They don't have enough money. Most emerging adults feel broke and are living paycheck to paycheck. And this is, exacerbated by things like the 2008 financial crisis that sort of hurt millennials more, to the point where, there's some economists saying the millennials will never catch up, right? They will never be in the position that, say, the baby boomers have been in terms of financial security. So there is all of that fun stuff. So they want to transition, but it's really hard. They're also transitioning, from the security of high school and the way life was structured. You knew what classes you were taking. It was told to you what you had to take. There were extracurriculars that your parents were probably involved in planning. To college, where in a sense no one cares. It is, you show up to class, you don't show up to class, you do your work, you don't do your work. That is entirely up to you. You're now treated as an adult. And they have to learn a host of new skills, right? Especially if they have moved out, things like paying bills, fixing things, like how do you do household repairs or other repairs without paying a bunch of money, getting insurance. How do you navigate romance, right? How do you navigate romantic relationships that start to get a little bit more serious than they were in high school? And this is the kind of things that millennials are having to deal with. And this is true of like all young people, right? And this is, what Gen Z in a lot of ways is going through right now. 13 years on from 2010, the generation going through this is no longer the millennials, it's Gen Z. So, one of the things that Smith and Snell note in their book, Lost in Transition and Souls in Transition, is that the millennials are a very optimistic generation, right? They believe wholeheartedly that the future is going to be a good one. And you see this in the work of Jean Twenge as well, right? That this is an optimistic generation. One thinks that things are going to work out for them at the end of the day. They're focused on a future, and they think the future is going to be bright, right? They're in their college years. They think life is going to be good. They face some challenges, but they're pretty sure that things are going to go well. And now they're aware that they're not where they'd like to be, right? But they're young, right? And they hold this kind of optimism about the future that, yeah, we're young, yeah, we're struggling, but things are going to turn out eventually. Now, less typically, there is a subset of our cohort here who are millennials, that know that optimism is normal, right? They know that it's, in their peers are optimistic about the future, but they struggle to be optimistic. They don't necessarily see the future as a particularly bright one. All right, so one of the things that Smith and Snell kind of point to is that millennials, while they're optimistic, they're not optimistic despite not having faced hardship, right? As they're coming through their teen years and into emerging adulthood, they've had their shares of problems, right? So among these are things like their own or others' alcoholism and drug use. The millennials, for better or worse, were a generation that was quite happy to experiment with substances and, as a result, experienced their fair share of problems with substances. Sexual exploitation, right? This is, among other things, the millennials were quite laissez-faire about their sexual attitudes. And so what ends up happening with the millennials, at least to some extent, is that, in kind of conjunction with hookup culture, some of them end up, being exploited sexually, being used, being sexually assaulted, and all of these sorts of things. Divorce, right? Their parents, right? Very few of the millennials, by 2010 would have been married and therefore divorced. Family breakdown, right? This is something that they've suffered. Relational betrayals, right? Cheating principally being the one that they're concerned about, right? Where romantic partners have cheated on them, left them, heartbroken. This is pretty consistent, though friendship betrayals also are not uncommon. Accidents, injuries, leading to changes in the way their lives are going to be lived. Academic failures, right? And here, dropping out of college due to academic failures is not uncommon for millennials, right? And really struggling with a lot of these things. Job disappointments, coming out into the workforce and finding a job is just not as easy as they wanted it to be. Parental abandonment. Not an unsubstantial number of millennials have had parents walk out on them. One parent abandoned them, both parents abandoned them, especially as they transition into adulthood, being sort of left to their own devices. And then, racism or other forms of discrimination. A lot of them have experienced that. And then death of friends, right? Not an uncommon experience for the millennials as they get to about 2010. So yeah, no shortage of hard experiences, but they remained optimistic at the end of the day. So even with all of that, right? Even with all the failures and all the hardships they've had, generally millennials would register kind of a thought that they're very forward-looking and that they don't regret the past, right? The past is the past for them. It's not weighing them down. It's not something that they spend too much time kind of thinking about and worrying about, right? Even when they admitted, potentially they were responsible for bad things that happened to them, they didn't dwell on them, right? So the idea with millennials in a lot of cases is you learn from the past, you move on, right? You become a bigger person, you move on. So the way they frame the past in a lot of ways is, it made me who I am today. And since the core of sort of millennials' experience of the world is discovering who you are, right? The process of self-discovery, you never sort of regret the past, right? You don't regret things because they made you who you are today. And because that is what's important in life, is figuring out who you really are. Well, you can't really, begrudge the past anything, right? So yeah, no regrets puts a sunny face on difficult matters, keeps the millennials moving forward. Having regrets being the equivalent of capitulating to self-doubt is not something the millennials are going to do, right? It sucked, but it made me a better person. It made me who I am. And that's how they view a lot of life's challenges, whether, they're the ones who caused it or not. All right. And then their parents, right? So as the millennials emerged from the teen years into emerging adulthood, generally what we find is that relationships with parents get better. And this is pretty natural, right? We see this broadly across generational cohorts. When you're a teenager and your life is sort of still being managed by your parents, it's a little bit more fraught, right? There's a little bit more resentment because there's still a little bit of control. But somewhere around, like 16-ish years old, some of this starts to kind of come apart. Parents back off. They start treating young people more like adults, right? They start downloading more and more responsibility onto their teenagers. And that tends to improve the relationship, right? So, it's like my parents are less controlling. I moved out, maybe I went to college, and they tend to see an improvement with their relationship. Again, they spend less time with their parents in this phase as well, which also tends to improve relationships with parents and all of that jazz. Now, for the most part, because it is our most important relationship, right? It's the one that we're going to have the longest in our lives. Most people have pretty good relationships with their parents to begin with, but those continue to get better over time. So yeah, as the relationship shifts more to an equal relationship, adult to adult, it gets significantly better. Now, there is still, of course, a significant minority of people whose parents are probably not the greatest, and who therefore still kind of have troubling relationships with their parents into emerging adulthood, right? And this is normal again. Like, you're not going to have everybody equally happy with the state of their relationships.